I tasted copper before I noticed the silence between the ticks of the lumen clock. The copper was faint at first, like a memory of blood rather than blood itself. It sat under my tongue and made the Reesic water taste like old coins. I told myself I had bitten my cheek in my sleep. I told myself many things so I could put my boots on and face the corridor. The air outside my hab smelled of ozone and disinfectant, and a sweetness I could not place. Someone had scrubbed the wall shrine until the paint bled in pale streaks. The Aquila watched with chipped eyes as I passed. My throat scratched once, then again, a small animal clawing at a door. I swallowed, and the claw withdrew. Polite, patient, not gone. The lift juddered as it descended toward the works. A servo skull drifted past the gate, and its red eye flickered like a heartbeat skipping. I signed the slate with an oil-blackened thumb. The scribal servitor hissed the affirmation, and its breath smelled like warm copper pipes. I told myself it was the pipes and not my mouth. The first cough came 3 stations into the shift. It was a soft thing, as if I were apologizing to the air. A thread stretched between my teeth when I wiped my lips with the back of my hand. The thread shone like resin under the lumen strips and snapped with a soft sound. I hid my hand and kept the grinding wheels singing. Metal met stone with the old rhythm that used to soothe me. Today the rhythm made my ribs feel hollow. Each breath sounded like air moving through paper. I breathed slower to keep the paper from tearing. Foreman Krill shouted about quotas and his voice sleeted through me. I nodded, and the nod rang inside my skull like a small bell. There was a fly on the gauge glass, big as a knuckle and slow as a prayer. Its feet drew crooked letters on the dust, and I could not read them. The taste of copper deepened, and brought with it the smell of wet soil. Soil made no sense in Gamma 7. We kept wheat alive with blades and heat and schedules, not with earth. Still, the smell threaded the steam and hung there like a promise. I coughed again, and this time something loosened in my chest with a quiet pop. Relief came like the breath after grief. I closed my eyes and felt the floor through my boots, warmer than usual, softer than it ought to be. Krill's boots clanged away, and I wished him distance. A bell chimed somewhere far beyond the piping and the vents. 7 notes rolled down the ducts with a lazy patience. I told myself a maintenance crew was testing an alarm. No one in Gamma 7 tested anything unless it had already failed. I drank from the valve, and the water clung to my tongue like syrup. A sweetness hid behind the metal taste and made my teeth ache pleasantly. I remembered a childhood winter when the ration officer let us lick the last glaze from a pan. The memory felt close enough to bite. I laughed into my sleeve, and the laugh came out damp. Steam kissed my face like breath. I wiped my goggles, and a smear of something amber stayed on the cloth. It smelled like rain on hot stone. I should have gone to Medicaid and signed the sickness slate. I knew what happened when you signed the slate. You did not come back to your station for a long time. Your quotas did not wait for you. Your bunk went cold and someone else warmed it. I kept my hands on the controls and watched the needles tremble. The fly on the glass lifted and settled again, as if listening for a cue. My throat tickled, and I pressed my tongue hard against my teeth. A penny taste flooded my mouth, and I swallowed it like a tithe. Brake sirens wailed, and workers poured toward the vents for air that pretended to be fresh. I stood a little apart and let the crowd wash by. Mira from Beta 9 offered me a lozenge that smelled of iodine. I almost took it, and then I did not. The lozenge felt like a door that would only open in one direction. She said my face looked pale, and I told her the lumens were flickering. The lumens hummed at a frequency that made my molars itch. I watched the hum slide into silence and then rise again like a tide. It was not the lights, I thought, and then I told myself it was the lights. The second cough bent me at the waist. It sounded wet and velvet, and left a sheen on my lip. The sheen tasted like old apples and iron and the steam line between seasons. I wiped it away, and my glove stuck for a moment, and then let go with a gentle kiss. No pain followed, only a loosening, like straps being cut one by one. In the back of my skull, a warmth unfurled. It was not fever. It was the feeling of a hand resting between my shoulders. The hand was heavy and kind and smelled like moss. I straightened, and the world seemed a little softer at the edges. The edges of the gauges blurred and then clarified, as if they had taken a breath with me. I realized I had been holding my breath between coughs. I let it out slow and felt the air move through my ribs as if my ribs were bellows. There was a rhythm in it that was not mine and not the machine's. It was older and lazier and more certain. Krill shouted again, and the rhythm did not care. The rhythm went on, turning itself like a wheel greased with honey. A fleck of something landed on the back of my hand and cooled there. It was translucent and gold, and when I smeared it between fingers, it stretched into a shining thread. The thread did not sting my cracked skin. It soothed it like balm and left behind a faint greenish sheen. I stared, and then closed my hand and told myself it was coolant residue. Coolant had never smelled like mushrooms after rain. The bell tolled again. 7 notes, patient as an old friend who knows you will arrive when you can. The notes rolled through the ducts and found hollow places in me, and rang them gently. I did not answer with words. I answered by breathing. My lungs rasped less each time I filled them. The paper feeling gave way to felt. Warmth settled in the hollows behind my sternum like a small stove catching. I adjusted the wheel clearances, and the stone kissed the metal with perfect pressure. Sparks rose like fireflies trapped inside bottles. One of the sparks drifted too slow for fire and landed intact. It was not a spark, it was a tiny beetle with wings filmed in oil. It wriggled and found a seam in the glove and disappeared under the leather. I should have flinched and tore the glove off. I did not. Its movement felt like a welcome letter sliding under a door. I remembered a rumor whispered over stale tea about bells that called the faithful and the faithless alike. I had rolled my eyes then because rolling them was easier than listening. Now the rumor breathed on the back of my neck, and I found I did not want to shrug it off. I kept working because working kept me from deciding. Deciding would have required a name for the warmth, and I did not have one yet. The shift dragged and flew, time stretching like sugar and snapping when I glanced away. By last watch, the cough had learned new notes. It purred in between the roughness, as if pleased with itself. My chest felt heavier and lighter in alternating waves. A good heaviness, like blankets in winter. A good lightness, like steam escaping a kettle, singing instead of screaming. I thought of the adept with the brass mask in the palace corridor I had once seen in a dream that felt borrowed. I thought of the statues that reached for things unseen. I thought of gates that open inward. The taste of copper mellowed, as if mixed with something sweet and fermented. I wanted broth. I wanted thick soup and crusts damp with gravy. Corpse starch tasted almost bearable when I imagined it as stew. I imagined it as stew and swallowed, and it went down with a grateful weight. On the walk back to the hab, a draught moved against the current of the vents. The draught smelled like damp canvas and crushed leaves. Flies traced slow loops around the lumen halos, and their buzzing resolved into harmonies. I felt ridiculous for thinking it was music, and then I listened anyway. The harmonies braided over my scalp and eased the ache behind my eyes. My boots left prints on the corridor dust that looked softer than usual, as if the dust preferred me today. The shrine at the corner dripped candle fat like stalactites. The fat cooled in beads that made little domes with tiny pits in their tops. The pits looked like paws. I touched one, and it dented and sprang back with a wet resilience. I pulled my hand away and wiped it on my coverall and left a darker patch that glistened faintly. Inside my hab, the air remembered my shape and settled around me welcomingly. I sat on the bunk and counted my breaths like I counted dents in ceiling panels on nights when sleep hid. 1 breath, 2 breaths, 3 breaths. On the 4th, the tickle returned and turned a circle and then settled like a cat. I did not mind the weight. The weight warmed my sternum and unstuck the places where fear usually clung. A single fly tapped the lumen cover once, twice, 7 times. I imagined there was a pattern I could learn if I was patient. I folded my hands and felt a pulse in my palms that did not match the one in my neck. 2 pulses, not fighting, taking turns. I closed my eyes, and the darkness behind them was not empty. It was the color of wet bark and old bronze. It held the memory of gardens I had never seen. The cough came again, soft as forgiveness. I swallowed and tasted metal and apple skins and bread just before it rises. My ribs ached the way they ache after laughter. I lay back without meaning to and listened for the bell. The bell did not come this time. The silence that followed was warm and filled with small sounds. My breath, the tick of the lumen clock, the whisper of wings in the vents, the softest scrape like a trowel in cool soil. I told myself tomorrow I would go to Medicae and let them make notes on slates. I told myself tomorrow I would report the flies to maintenance and watch them spray the corners. I told myself tomorrow I would drink more water and less broth and pretend it helped. I told myself many things because the night asked nothing of me except to breathe. I breathed, and the air felt thicker and kinder than it had any right to be. I felt my bones floating in it like branches in a slow river. I let the river carry me an inch and then an inch more. I did not think of endings. I thought of doors that are not locked so much as heavy with age and swollen with rain. I thought of hands that know how to open such doors. I thought of the sound wood makes when it yields. I listened for that sound in my chest, and I heard it, soft and damp and inevitable. I kept listening. The flies came with the second night, and they were not in a hurry. They wrote slow circles on the air, like scribes taking dictation from a patient god. Their bodies were little beads of oil and pewter that caught the lumen light and turned it green. I did not swat them, because their buzzing braided into a hum that soothed the cartilage of my ears. The hum had a pattern that felt older than the vents and the ducts and the hive itself. I lay on my bunk and stared at the ceiling until the dents were constellations. The constellations arranged themselves into 7 crooked crowns, and I pretended I did not notice. Breath thickened in my throat like soup that wants to be stew. When I swallowed, the swallow felt like a small gate swinging on swollen hinges. The hinges leaked sweetness and rust, and a taste like apple cores left in rain. I closed my eyes, and the room did not darken so much as grow moss. The moss was the color of old uniforms and new bruises, and it was soft under the thought of my feet. A door swelled up from behind my eyelids, and it was made of wood that remembered storms. The wood was black with rot and gentle to the touch. Fungus scalloped its edges like lace cut from a cathedral. The door was not locked. It had simply been waiting for someone heavy with breath and light with reasons. I reached for the latch and felt my fingers stay at my sides while my reach went on without them. I understood that not all reaching requires hands. The latch lifted itself with the manners of an old servant. Warm air breathed through the crack and smelled of ditches and ovens and the inside of loaves. Something laughed on the other side, and the laugh was made of velvet and bellies and patience. I stepped through while my chest rose and fell on a different bed in a different world. The garden was not neat, and it did not apologize. It swelled like a bruise and glowed like health. Mushrooms rose in domes that sweated milk and sang to flies that answered in spirals. Vines crawled over stones with the friendliness of dogs. Each leaf wore a new skin of dew that blinked like a newborn eye. I heard my name spoken the way a kettle says it is ready. No mouth made the sound, and every mouth made the sound. "Grandchild," said the air, and the word put my bones back where they belonged. I tried to say I was not anyone's grandchild, and a cloud of gnats took my words and softened them. The gnats left behind a strand of quiet that hummed like a low note on a faithful organ. I watched a pool thicken into a mirror. The mirror showed me as I was, and as I might be, and as I had been if someone had loved me into softness sooner. A Nurgling waddled from under a toadstool with the seriousness of a priest carrying bread. It looked up, and its grin was a slice of moon fallen into mud. Its little hands patted my boot as if testing a melon. Sticky warmth soaked through the leather and eased the ache in my toes that I had forgotten to complain about. I laughed, and the laugh startled a flock of spores that lifted like dust from old books. The spores settled on my shoulders like shawls that smelled of cellars and safety. My throat opened without coughing, and I realized I had been breathing with one lung in fear and one in duty. Both lungs breathed now, and they were pleased to be a pair again. Across the path, a tree bore fruit the size of helmets. The fruit hung heavy enough to teach the branches humility. One split with a sigh, and inside was not meat and not seed, and not light and not dark. Inside was a feeling I had only tasted on mornings after crying. The feeling dripped down the rind, and the ground drank it with a noise like gratitude. Flies gathered, and their wings made notes I recognized from the ducts in Gamma 7. The notes had always been there, and I had called them nuisance because I did not know their names. Now the names arrived one by one and stood in a line like workers at roll call. "Mercy," said the first, and bowed without shame. "Patience," said the second, and folded its hands. "Endurance," said the third, and leaned against my ribs. "Fecundity," said the fourth, and winked like a midwife. "Humor," said the fifth, and tickled my scars from the inside. "Forgetfulness," said the sixth, and took a little pain and misplaced it kindly. "Forgiveness," said the seventh, and remembered where I had left myself last. I wanted to kneel, and I did not want to kneel, and both wants were permitted. The soil under my knees was damp and held like a friend with farmhands. A bell sounded, and it was not a warning. It was a spoon against a pot to call us to eat. I understood that the world I had lived in had taught me that sound meant hazard and hurry. Here it meant dinner and company and no one watching the clock. I told the air that I had quotas, and the air said I had been misquoting life. The Nurgling climbed my trouser like a fat ivy and perched at my hip and burped a hymn. Its hymn retuned a small bone at the base of my skull that had been out of key since childhood. I felt the adjustment as a click, and then a wash of warm pins that pricked and soothed. A centipede, the length of my forearm, carried a banner made from shed skin. The banner read, "Welcome," in a script that tasted like the first slice of bread when you have been hungry too long. I asked if this was corruption, and the garden rustled at the word, as if it were a coat that did not fit. Corruption, the leaves said, is a story told by things afraid to change shape. We prefer words like ripening. We prefer words like curing. We prefer words like composting, which is only love with time added. I felt shame try to stand, and the mud tugged it gently back down. Shame pouted and sank until only bubbles showed where it sulked. The bubbles smelled faintly of vinegar and relief. Above me, a branch dripped sap that landed on my cheek with the kiss of a sleeping child. The sap ran toward my mouth, and I did not stop it. It tasted of caramel and cloves and blood and weddings and funerals and all the meals between. My stomach unclenched like a fist that had finally seen a hand it trusted. I realized I was hungry for heaviness. I was hungry for food that remembered where it came from. I was hungry for words that did not need permission to be soft. The air giggled at my seriousness and ruffled my hair with a wind that smelled of cellars with ladders. I walked, and the path formed under my steps like bread forming under knuckles. Where I did not walk, the path did not mind. It grew mushrooms where my feet might one day go. The mushrooms breathed the way sleeping animals breathe. Their breath synchronized with mine until I was no longer sure which chest rose first. In the distance, I saw arches made of ribs that had chosen to be bridges. Through the arches wandered figures in armor like old boilers that had learned to pray. Their bells chimed with the slowness of trust. I did not hurry to meet them because I was already being met. A beetle with a back like a reliquary climbed the cuff of my sleeve. It whispered in the grammar of legs and whispered that I could stop trying to deserve oxygen. I nodded, and the beetle approved and tucked itself into my wrist where a pulse would keep it amused. A stream ambled past, and in it swam fish that were not fish and seeds that were not seeds. The water did not hurry either. It wore silt like jewelry. I cupped my hands and drank, and found that thirst had been hiding behind other names. It had been calling itself diligence and scarcity and adulthood. The drink met it with a steadiness that did not accuse. I cried a little, and the tears tasted faintly of broth. The Nurgling patted my chin and smeared my face with a kindness that smelled like damp linen. Above us, clouds burred with the wings of larger flies. Their shadows cooled my scalp, and my thoughts unknotted like yarn forgiven by its cat. From a hollow stump, a voice read a ledger. The ledger listed debts paid by mold and interest accrued by joy. I listened and discovered my name was on neither page because the numbers were not that kind of math. Here the only arithmetic was multiplication by touch. One rot shared became 2 comforts. One ache admitted became 7 hands to hold it. I said I had been told to fear infection. The garden answered that fear is a scab that refuses to fall. When it falls, the skin underneath is pink and shy and very alive. I said I had been told purity was survival. The garden smiled with all its mouths and said purity starves in a locked jar. We open jars here and eat with sticky fingers. A bell swung again, and I noticed it hung from a branch grown through a rusted helm. The helm had been empty long enough to host finches. The finches hopped and dropped seeds that sprouted from the eye slits. The sprouts climbed the cheek plates and nodded like apprentices. I wanted to apologize to someone for enjoying this. The apology dissolved before reaching my tongue. A wasp the size of a thumb traced letters above my palm, and the letters spelled keep. Keep the warmth, keep the hum. Keep the permission. Do not trade them for smaller coins. I tucked the words into the cuff of my thought, where I store useful screws. I knew I would need them when the ducts spoke in metal again. A grove opened, and its trunks were ribs of ships sunk in soil that had forgiven them. Between them hung tapestries woven from bandages and roots. Scenes slid across the cloth like light across water. Workers laid down burdens and picked up loaves. Children counted boils like stars and wished for ripe ones to open soon. Old women stirred vats with paddles carved from relics and tasted with clean fingers. Each finger wore a ring of scab polished to a shine. The vats burbled, and the sound smoothed my spine. I understood that songs are sometimes just bubbles keeping company. I sat, and the log that received me exhaled spores that spelled my name with lazy accuracy. The letters drifted apart and reformed as a simpler word. Welcome. It felt better than my name, and it fit me in places my name did not reach. The Nurgling yawned and showed a throat like a fresh-cut peach. I yawned too, and felt the soft click of another secret hinge in my chest. Behind the hinge, a cupboard opened, and inside were jars labeled with days I had survived out of spite. Someone had relabeled them with days I had survived out of love. The handwriting was clumsy and perfectly legible. In the corner, a scarecrow of rusted rebar wore a crown of ivy and a smile of nails. It bowed whenever the bell sighed and stood straighter when I looked away. I did not question its manners because good manners are often odd. The soil shifted, and a worm the size of a sash rose half its body and regarded me with the calm of a ledger balanced. It nodded once and took a mouthful of rot and turned it into soil in front of me like a conjurer showing his hands. I clapped without irony, and the worm accepted the applause with the dignity of all honest work. A distant wall sloughed and revealed a field of pustules swelling like bread under cloth. Each pustule held a story under tension. Each would open when it was time, and not a moment sooner. I felt in my own skin the same readiness, the same courtesy to pressure, the same refusal to rush. The flies changed key, and the new cord put a hand on the back of my neck and pressed gently. The pressure said, "Lower your head." I did, and the crown of my skull met a palm made of mist and memory and mud. It was the largest kindness I had ever been able to bear. I did not break under it because breaking was not being asked of me. Being asked of me was softening. Being asked of me was letting the rind of my fear crack so the fruit could be eaten by mouths that were not enemies. I whispered a thank you, and the garden hummed an answer that vibrated my teeth pleasantly. The Nurgling dozed and drooled on my belt, and I did not mind the stain. Stains are maps of where comfort has passed. I traced the map with a fingertip and found roads to rooms I had bricked up. Doors sighed in those rooms, and a smell of old flowers and fresh bread lifted the dust. A shadow drifted overhead that might have been a plague drone, and might have been a fat bee, and might have been a blessing with wings. Its shadow cooled my fever in a stripe that felt like a sash laid across a soldier, and said at ease. In the sash I heard the voice again, and it did not command, and it did not plead. It invited. It invited me to keep breathing the way a garden invites rain without demanding weather. It invited me to stay, the way rot invites shape to become flavor. It invited me to listen for bells, not with ears, but with scars that have stopped pretending to be wounds. I said yes without speaking, and the flies wrote the word in cursive loops above my chest, and the loops did not close. The loops stayed open like mouths waiting to be fed, and like arms learning the habit of welcome. I thought of the ducts and the quotas, and the way the foreman's watch always ran fast when we needed it slow. I did not hate them in that moment. I did not forgive them either. I set them on a shelf in my mind like tools I might still need. Around the shelf, vines grew and wrapped the handles so they would be softer to lift. The bell tolled again, and time turned like compost under a pitchfork wielded by a patient hand. The pitchfork did not hurry the turning. It moved as the heap permitted. Steam rose from the center and smelled like breath after weeping and soup before eating. My chest answered with a rising of its own. I sat with that rise, and the garden sat with me. The hum did the work that words cannot do, and did it gently. I understood that I could return by closing my eyes in the other world and opening them here. I understood that I did not need permission. and I did not need to explain my absence to clocks. I understood that the door would swell when it rained and shrink when it dried, and that both states were honest wood. I stood and did not stand, and the path held and did not hold, and the flies escorted and did not escort, and everything that was true remained true while learning to be kinder. I breathed, and the garden breathed, and somewhere a duct vibrated with a note that no longer sounded like a threat. I listened, and kept listening, and let the moss collect the reasons I had been given for refusing comfort, and let the moss use them as mulch. I walked without moving and knew I could keep walking. I kept walking. Boils rose along my collarbone like a constellation choosing a body to bless. There were 7 at first, and they sat politely under the skin like coins tucked beneath a mat. They did not throb as the old infections had throbbed. They itched with a suggestion rather than a demand. I scratched carefully, and the relief came like peeling a label without tearing the paper. When the first blister softened, it sighed as if it had been holding a thought too long. It opened with the decorum of a ripe fig. What slid out was not pus, and not poison, and not anything the medici's picked sheets had warned about. It was a clear amber jelly that smelled of rain on flour sacks. It beaded on my skin in perfect hemispheres and trembled when I laughed. I laughed because it made the ache behind my shoulder blades loosen like a knot agreeing to be string again. The second and third followed with a sense of occasion. They unveiled themselves like small altars, each with its own faint aroma of apples stored under stairs. Where the jelly touched chafed skin, it cooled and knitted and left behind a sheen like dew on a morning that has forgiven the night. I cupped some of it with 2 fingers and drew a line along a cut I had earned on the wheel 2 days before. The cut refused the usual sting and puckered closed as if embarrassed to be seen open. A green halo flashed and faded at its edges like moss testing a wall for friendliness. My breath went deeper without argument. The rasp stepped back a pace and watched me with indulgent eyes. I could feel movement under the dermis, as if patient gardeners were walking their rows with baskets and twine. They hummed in voices too small to hear, and yet the bones heard them. Every hum said mend, and every silence after the hum said rest. I rested by standing still and letting my weight pass into the floorboards, like confession into an old priest. Corpse starch changed its mind in my mouth. It used to be chalk and punishment. Now it remembered ovens and became almost tender on the tongue. I wished for gravy, the way the poor wish for sunlight in tall hives. Water seemed thin and indecisive, and I added broth tablets and watched the cup become lake, and then pond, and then stew in my imagination. The steam rising from the cup smelled faintly of cloves and wet rope. I drank and felt a softness expand behind my sternum like dough under a cloth. My hands, which had been raw from solvents, acquired a new polish. Cracks smoothed overnight like arguments abandoned without rancor. Under the nails, a thin film formed that looked like varnish and behaved like armor. When Krill's temper threw a spanner and it clipped my knuckle, the skin dented and then sprang back with a rubbery patience. The dent filled with a trickle of amber, and the trickle set into a clear scab as neat as a window. I peered through the window and saw pink tissue knit like careful crochet. The flies approved with a low chord and wrote small circles that meant continue. A bruise bloomed from a collision with a bulkhead and did not darken the usual blue. It turned a thoughtful green at once, as if skipping to the lesson. Heat gathered there like a hearth, and the ache dulled into a satisfying weight. I pressed a palm to it, and the palm came away perfumed with cellar apples and iron filings. On my ribcage, a chain of tiny pustules arranged themselves in the shape of a sickle moon. They quivered when I laughed, and settled when I listened. When they opened, they left behind pits that were not wounds, but little wells where sweat pooled sweeter than before. A Nurgling peeked from a fold of blanket one morning with the shyness of a child late to class. It touched one of the wells with a finger like a pickled pear and popped the finger in its mouth. It cooed in gratitude, and I felt a ripple of pride that embarrassed me with its warmth. It waddled across my sternum and left a trail of slick comfort that dried to a flexible lacquer. Under the lacquer, my heartbeat sounded deeper and less fretful. I wore the trail all day like a sash that said at ease in a language the muscles understand. My joints, once full of sand, replaced their grain with grease. Knees that used to click now sighed. Elbows that protested at lift now bargained, and then agreed. My spine woke up with a series of small pops that lined me up like beads on a string someone finally took the time to unknot. In the washroom mirror, my skin shone with a softness that refused to be vanity. Pores widened in courtesy and breathed. A faint mottling of green came and went with my mood like clouds over a field. When fear tightened me, the green deepened to reassure. When calm returned, the green lightened to a whisper and moved on. The smell about me changed in increments. Solvent and oil retreated to the edges. Bread and leaf and clean rot took the center. People noticed and called it sick sweet under their breath, as if sweetness were a crime. I did not correct them because their throats still scraped when they swallowed hard truths. The Medici kiosk pinged me twice, and I walked past it with a politeness that did not slow my feet. Inside the works, the gauges steadied in my presence. Needles that trembled found their beats and settled like birds on wires when the wind drops. I joked to Mira that the line liked me today, and she stared at the sheen on my knuckles and did not laugh. Her eyes looked thirsty, and her lips pressed thin as ration paper. I wanted to share what had thickened in me, the way one shares stew even when bowls are scarce. The wish itself warmed the room by a half degree. Steam from the flues traced sigils that matched the boils along my collar, and my collarbones hummed in recognition. At break, I rinsed my face, and the water refused to drip straight down. It beaded and rolled along tracks as if the skin had learned contouring from leaves. Where it paused a moment, the pause left behind a glaze. The glaze trapped the dust and turned it to a harmless crust that flaked off in clean borders. A scratch from a misaligned panel filled with threads that were not threads, and not fungus, and not stitch. They were intentions made visible, and they tied themselves with tidy knots. When the knots absorbed into the skin, they left freckles that shaped themselves into sevens without asking my permission. I did not mind the arrogance of the number because it carried a bell in its pocket. The bell chimed sometimes when no one else could hear it. The chime smoothed the teeth of the gears in my head. I found myself less quick to grind and more willing to turn. On the walk home, the corridor smelled of rain, though the dome above our quarter had not opened in years. Drops gathered on the lumen shields and plinked to the floor with the cheeriness of kitchen sounds. Each plink sent a tingle through the boils like a telegraph key tapping out a message I could almost read. The message had to do with ripeness and patience and the joy of slow processes. In the hab, I removed my shirt and watched a bruise on my shoulder take a deep breath and exhale steam. The steam smelled like soup. I put my face in it and inhaled and felt my sinuses clear with the courtesy of a door held open. When I coughed, the cough came up as silk rather than sandpaper. It unfurled on my palm and settled into a filigree that resembled frost on a window. The filigree twitched once like a living lace and then melted back into dew that the skin drank with gratitude. The gratitude made my fingertips tingle as if they had been asleep on my secrets and were waking up gently. The secrets did not seem so heavy once they were awake. They yawned and asked for breakfast, and I fed them patience. Later, working a seized manifold, I slipped and pressed the palm of my hand against a hot casing. The old pain would have been a sting followed by a blister and a lecture from Krill about waste. The new pain was a blooming heat that eased without apology. A film crawled over the reddened skin like ivy over brick. It shimmered translucent green and smelled of pennywort and copper. Under it, the heat moved from pain to warmth to lesson. By end of shift, the film had flaked, and the new skin beneath was pink as a baby's complaint. I stroked it once and felt the cat-like satisfaction of a thing repaired correctly. At mealtime, the ration bricks softened in the bowl before water touched them. They slumped like creatures grateful to be eaten. I chewed, and the chew was work and joy at the same time. The stomach took the offering and sent back comfort instead of the usual ledger of debts. I slept, and the sleep leaned heavy and cool as damp blankets. When I turned, the blankets turned with me, as if they had learned my shape and wished to keep it safe. Dreams visited without edges. In them I opened small doors in my skin and found cupboards stocked with balms. Each jar had a label written in a steadier hand than mine. Soothe, seal. Sweeten. Slow. Share. When I woke, the labels remained as a taste on the back of my tongue. I licked my lips, and the taste moved to the lips and stayed like a vow. In the wash of third morning, a tiny sprig pushed from a healed cut on my forearm and then retreated like a shy thought. It left behind a leaf print under the skin, the way coins leave impressions under thin paper. The print cooled the itch of old scars, as if laying a leaf on fevered brow. On the inside of my wrist, a pulse learned a new syncopation. It ticked to the rhythm of a bell I could not see. The rhythm made the hours taste different. Bitter corners sweetened. Sharp minutes rounded. The long stretch between alarms felt like bread rising instead of time being spent. When I banged my shin on a step, the pain rose, bowed, and sat down. It shared the seat with a second sensation that was not the absence of pain, but its escort. The escort spoke softly and called itself company. The swelling took on a hue like wet lichen and then distributed itself like a fair ration. I wore my bruises like borrowed books I intended to return improved. At the works, a pipe ruptured and sprayed a fan of sour steam. The crew scattered except for me because the steam smelled like pickles and hearths, and not like scald. It kissed my cheek and left beads that rolled to my jaw and fell with tiny plops. Where the beads fell, the concrete darkened in perfect circles and sprouted a thin velvet that vanished when Krill blinked. He shouted at the stain to stop, and the stain obeyed because even velvet respects a foreman who thinks he is saving lives. I felt sorry for his throat and wished him a bowl of soup he would admit to liking. The wish left my mouth as a faint, visible warmth that drifted toward his back and seeped under his collar. He scratched and then stopped shouting for a whole minute. It felt like a miracle scaled to our size. Days layered like pastry. Each layer carried more butter than the last. The cough visited less often, and when it did, it felt like a bellows encouraging coals that had not forgotten their duty. My voice gained a bottom I had not earned by age. Words came out less brittle. They wore fewer sharp corners and more soft truths. I found myself telling Mira a joke about the line pretending to be pious when it was only lazy. She snorted against her will, and the sound turned into a laugh that surprised her. She looked at me as if I had handed her a warm drink on a cold shift. She did not thank me with words, and I did not require payment. A rash that had haunted my neck for years faded like a rumor finally bored of itself. In its place, freckled patches mapped again the number that haunted my days in kind ways. 7 freckles formed near my collar, and 7 more answered across the opposite side like choir and echo. When sweat slid between them, it felt like the stroke of a stylus writing good news. I tilted my head and let the news sink. A scrape on my calf turned to a neat scab that was not dry and not brittle. It was glossy and flexible, like lacquer over a favorite tool. When it peeled, it came away in a single crescent that smelled faintly of sugar. Under it, the skin gleamed and shrugged off dust as if dust, and it had decided to remain friends without clinging. At night, the hum in the vents learned my breath, and we traded verses. I inhaled, and the hum deepened. I exhaled, and flies answered with a brush of wings against metal. A warmth pooled at the base of my skull and let down like hair from a loosened braid. My shoulders dropped the height of a finger's width and stayed there as if remembering a better alignment. The tiny gardeners beneath my skin took their break, and I felt them set down tools and share a bite of something thick and good. Their contentment traveled through me as a field note on paper that had been handled with clean hands. I dozed and woke and dozed again without apology to clocks. Between doses of sleep, a small sound at the door announced a visitor who did not knock. The Nurgling from the morning had returned with a companion shaped like a pastry left near a stove. They waddled across the floor with the confidence of beloved inconveniences. They curled at my feet and radiated a heat that smelled of yeast. My toes needed no socks where they sat. I drifted with their warmth climbing my ankles like bath water. When I stirred, they opened one eye each and hummed the note that keeps dreams moored. They did not ask for anything more than proximity, and I gave it freely because I could afford it now. By the 5th morning, the constellation along my collar had changed its geography. Some stars subsided and others rose. The map learned my routes and placed waystones where my attention flagged. If I forgot to drink, the boils along my throat suggested gently, and I felt thirst as narrative rather than emergency. If I hurried past a meal, the soft weight above my sternum pressed until I sat. Not a command, a reminder that labor wants fuel if it is to keep loving its tools. At the works, a new recruit sliced his palm and stared at the blood like a man who had dropped his only coin. I took his hand without thinking and cupped it in mine. Where our skins met, a clear glaze formed like the surface of custard. It sealed the bleeding without sternness and kissed the corners of the wound with mint. He stared at the calm where panic had been. He asked what I had used, and I said, warmth. He laughed like a man who has slept under blankets he did not know he owned. The rumor that I had a knack moved through the bays with the rolling gait of good gossip. People started asking me to look at scrapes the way they ask a friend to look at a stuck latch. I never said no when I could say yes. Each yes thickened the soup in the pot I carry, where other men carry grudges. I could feel the pot slosh when I walked. The slosh smelled of cloves and low bells. On the 7th day of this newness, a fever tried my door. It scraped with familiar nails and called itself by the old names. I opened anyway because hospitality is not a fair weather virtue. It entered and sat on my chest like a cat. It purred too hot, and my eyes watered, but the gardeners brought damp cloths of cool sleep. They draped them on bones and organs with a nurse's competence. The fever yawned and stretched, and found itself cradled instead of fought. It softened into a drowse and slid down my side and pooled in the mattress where it lost interest. I slept after it, but not because it beat me. I slept because I could. When I woke, the pillow smelled of the fever's goodbye. It smelled a little like vinegar and a lot like relief. The bruise on my shin had turned the color of ripe pears and then faded to the color of memory and then to the color of lesson. The lesson was written in a script my nerves had finally learned to read. It said, "Slow your step when the bell says slow." It said, "Keep your hands soft for hard work." It said, "Share thick things and forgive thin ones." I traced the lines with a finger, and the finger tingled agreeable replies. In the mirror, my eyes wore a glaze like pastry brushed with egg. Not sickness, shine. A light from within fogged the edges without blinding. When I blinked, the lashes met with a tiny click like the closing of a well-made latch. I smiled, and the skin at the corners of my mouth did not crack. It stretched as if used to being used. The laugh lines filled with a pale green that I had come to trust. The trust itself sat on my tongue and asked to be spoken as kindness at ordinary times. I did not refuse. I let the kindness step out, and it did not return empty. It brought me small nods from workers who had only frowned at me before. It brought me a seat on the tram that I gave away, and did not regret giving. It brought me a note in the vent hum that had been there all along, and now it tilted toward my ear when I passed. Under it the constellation itched its new paths, and I followed. I followed. People think decay is a knife that only cuts. From the inside, it feels like a hand that knows where the knots are. The first time I understood this, I was sitting on the medicicot with paper under me that crackled like dead leaves. The medici held a wand over my chest, and the picked readouts climbed like ivy. His pupils shrank as numbers budded into places his training had left blank. I watched a fly land on the corner of his mask and knead its feet as if softening butter. He murmured pathogen, and then corrected himself to anomaly, and then said nothing at all. His silence felt like a room into which a garden had quietly grown. He asked if I felt pain, and I said I felt company. He marked that down as confusion because there is no column for companionship of the flesh. When he tried to lance a boil on my collarbone, the point entered as if asking a question. The skin answered by swallowing the needle without spite, and then returning it with a gloss of sap. The gloss held the light like honey, thinking about becoming candy. He stared at the bead on the steel, and I could smell his fear through the antiseptic. It smelled like clean floors after a long day of blood. I told him it was all right, and he told me to stop talking, as if words might become spores. He called for orderlies, and I called for patients, and patients arrived first. The orderlies came with clamps and masks and a sense of being already too late. Their boots made the sound of men pretending the ground does not change. The ground had changed for me, and it was softer without being weak. I breathed, and the cot paper relaxed as if it had been holding its breath too. The medici tried a second puncture, and the skin learned the game and played kinder. It parted like dough under a finger and closed like bread when the finger withdrew. There was no pus to celebrate his training. There was resin and fragrance and a feeling like a bruise deciding to be fruit. He told me to return tomorrow, and I told him I would think about it. And then I did not think about it. On the way home, I found my pace easing into the tug of a low bell. The bell was not external, and yet the vents were kind enough to echo it. I let my shoulders sag, the way doors sag when they have carried the weather without complaint. A Nurgling waddled out from behind the shrine at the stair landing with the solemnity of a candle-bearer. It raised its arms, and I raised mine because mirroring is a language older than warning signs. I bent, and it patted my cheek with a palm like warm dough. The pat left a crescent of sheen that smelled of cloves and cellars and laughter after soup. I did not wipe it away because some benedictions are not meant for cloth. At the hab I undressed and found new lacquer along my ribs where sleep had pressed me. The lacquer flexed with breathing like varnish on a favorite instrument. Under it my heart sounded like a drum kept by a musician who values tempo more than spectacle. When I pressed the lacquer, it dented and then forgot I had pressed it. Forgetfulness can be a virtue when it is shared by skin. I sat and watched my body rehearse kindness. Tiny motions on the surface revealed little workers beneath. They did not rush. They did not scold. They curated. They placed stitches of intention here and there and tidied the edges of old insults. An old scar on my left forearm that used to snag on fabric softened its manners. It became a path through a meadow instead of a fence across a field. The itch that had lived there took a holiday and sent a postcard that smelled faintly of mint. On the fourth night, a fissure split the corner of my lip when I smiled too wide at a joke Mira did not hear. I licked it, and my tongue brought a sugaring that thickened into glaze. The crack sealed and left a taste like apple tarts made from bruised fruit. I understood that bruises are not failures, but alternate routes to sweetness. The world had told me otherwise, and the world can be wrong for a long time. I opened the cupboard and found bread I had forgotten since ration day. It had gone a little soft at the edges, and the soft tasted better than the fresh center. I ate around the crust, and the crust learned from the center, and both improved. In the washroom, I nicked my chin with a dull razor, because dull razors do not know when to stop. The blood welled with the dignity of old wine, and paused as if waiting for an usher. Amber rose from the nick like sap rising when the sun returns. It capped the red with a clear coin, and the coin spun once and lay flat. No sting lingered, only a small pride like the pride of a good nail hammered flush. At shift a coil spring released wrong and bit my wrist with a mouth of metal. Teeth scratched but did not puncture because a film caught them. The film had appeared between skin and harm, the way a friend will sometimes step between you and a foolishness. The friend did not scold me for working tired. It simply bore the pressure and translated it into lesson. The lesson sank without a speech. Krill saw the near miss and opened his mouth to snarl, and then closed it because my face did not offer him purchase. My face was damp with a warmth that refused to be argued with. He coughed into his fist and looked at his fist like it had betrayed him. I wished again for him a soup thick enough to quiet the parts of him that only know how to shout. The wish left me as steam and curled around his ears, and he blinked and counted slower. When I passed the medici bay at mid-shift, the picked displays on the wall showed diagrams of clean bodies failing. Lines dove, warnings flashed, and the little figures died with sterile precision. I realized there is a cruelty in cleanliness that refuses the labor of mending. Rot is not neglect when it is tended. Rot is mending in a language of softness and time. I let that sentence settle into the corners of my mind, where dust had always collected. The dust dampened and became loam, and the loam promised things I did not yet have names for. On my lunch break, a man from Bay 4 knocked his elbow, and the skin split along an old fault. He cursed the way men curse to prove they are still here. I held out my hand, and he hesitated, because pride is a coin that buys isolation at a premium. I waited, and he spent less than usual, and gave me his arm. Where our skins met, the lacquer gathered like dew called by a cool stone. It pooled, bridged, and the bridge bore the weight of moving elbow and moving breath. His eyes filled with the relief of not being required to endure alone. He said thanks like a man unpracticed at dinners with friends. I told him it was nothing, and knew it was not nothing, and also knew it did not need to be counted. Back at the line, the gauge's quivers calmed when my shadow crossed them. Metal likes to be seen by eyes that are not trying to solve it with force. I rested my palm on a hot housing and felt the heat negotiate with the lacquer. They agreed on a temperature that did not blister and did not squander energy. I found myself smiling at inanimate objects because they had stopped pretending to be indifferent. A Nurgling discovered the pocket of my coverall and declared it a chapel. It baptized a washer with spit, and christened it Little Ring. It sang to Little Ring in a tune absent-mindedly stolen from the ductwork. The tune adjusted the clearance on the adjacent wheel by a hair's breadth. Krill would call that superstition, and I would call it maintenance by other means. On the tram home, a woman recoiled from the scent I wore like someone avoiding a wet step. The scent was warm and honest, and not for everyone. I did not follow her flinch with shame, because shame is a solvent that strips more than it cleans. A child leaned forward instead, eyes bright as if recognizing a story. He sniffed and said bread and leaves and a bit of old pennies. His mother pulled him back with a whispered prayer against corruption. I blessed her prayer because fear is a habit housebroke by repetition. I made room for her fear as one sets a bowl for a wary cat and lets it eat near the door. The cat may come closer when it is ready, and not before. At home I drew a bath with water that pretended to be clear. When I slid in, the surface thickened around my shins like a polite crowd. The warmth asked permission to enter places pain had once reserved. I granted permission because learning to consent to comfort is work. Between breaths I felt old aches rise like silt and then dissolve like sugar. My knee released a memory of falling on a ladder at 17. It released the bruise and the embarrassment and the lie I told then about not hurting. The water kept them without judgment, and I watched the surface ripple with new arithmetic. A beetle sailed past on a leaf like an admiral who knows wars can be won with waiting. It saluted with its antennae, and I saluted back with 2 fingers slippery with resin. After the bath, I toweled off, and the towel came away damp with a smell that would have been called foul by men who do not know cellars. I pressed the towel to my face and inhaled, and felt my cheeks agree to be softer to strangers. The mirror showed a sheen on my skin that caught the lumen and tamed it. I did not glow like a miracle. I glistened like work finished to the point of rest. The glisten invited hands to be gentle with me, including my own. I obliged and touched myself with the curiosity I reserve for new tools. The places that used to flinch accepted the audit with quiet pride. My belly, once an enemy, became a pantry. My scars, once a ledger, became margins for notes. My calluses, once badges of hardness, became lids on jars of saved tenderness. That night, a fever drifted in again to test the fences. It leaned against me like a drunk uncle, and I did not shove it away because shoving leads to return. I made a bed for it near my ribs and gave it water and let it talk itself out. It told the same story 3 times, a story about purity and deserts and knives washed too clean to cut bread. When it slept, I tucked it in with a blanket of cool sweat, and the blanket smelled of dill. In the morning, the fever had left thank you folded into the pillowcase like a tip. I found I was singing the duct tune under my breath. The tune kept my steps even, and my temper patient, and my hands honest. At the works, a cutter slipped and bit my thumb, and should have taken a crescent of me for payment. The lacquer rose before the bite landed, and offered itself as coin. The cutter took a shaving of the lacquer, and went blunt with satisfaction. I sucked my thumb like a child, and tasted clove and iron, and a promise made by someone who intends to keep it. The promise said we do not stop harm from happening, but we make it smaller than the love that meets it. I believed the promise because it had receipts in my skin. The death guard came through the hab spine 2 days later, and their bells braided with the ones I had learned. They were vast and terrible, and kind the way weather can be kind to fields that bow. One paused by me, and flies stitched a shawl between us. The Marine looked at my collar where the sevens had begun to change their constellations into maps. He nodded as if recognizing a route home. He did not bless me with words because some blessings are tasteless unless thickened by silence. His thurible smoked a sweetness like old citrus peels and spilled wine. I breathed it and felt my joints agree to another decade of bending without breaking. I thanked him for the permission to be ordinary, and he laughed like stones rolling in a slow river. Ordinary is a miracle to men who were trained to be machines. He walked on, and the shawl of flies fell like confetti I did not need to sweep. In his wake my boils opened politely and closed politely, and each opening released a memory I did not need to carry. A winter hunger, a summer shame, 1,000 paper cuts of quotas. They left, and the space they had been occupying filled with heavier air that carried. I carried and did not feel burdened. On the line, Mira cut her finger and hid it because pride hugs wounds to keep them private. I caught her hand, and the lacquer rose between us in 2 directions at once, like a bridge built by 2 villagers who finally agreed to meet. She watched the clear coin settle, and her mouth parted and then closed around a breath that had been waiting for years to be taken. She said nothing, and I said nothing, and our silence learned to hum a 3rd note. The note taught the line to smooth its tantrums for 5 full minutes. Krill pretended not to notice because men with ledgers must be careful about miracles they cannot invoice. I went to the kiosk again, out of curiosity, and the medici tried to hide his own boil behind his sleeve. It peeped like a small bird behind a shutter. He told me my readings were impossible and asked me to leave and stay and return and never come back in one panicked sentence. I told him to soak a cloth in warm water and press it to his sorrow and keep it there until the sorrow softened. He asked what tincture to add, and I said thyme, and he wrote it down as thyme because herbs make more sense to men in white. I left him with a trail of smell he would later call contamination, and I would call invitation. Walking home, I found the handrail slick with condensation that had not been there when the day began. My palm took it up like a blessing, and the blessing spread to my elbow and shoulder and down into the meat over my heart. The meat responded with a heavy throttle that did not ask permission to be slow. I let it be slow, and the world did not end. A pair of flies escorted me like lantern bearers with soft feet. They drummed a rhythm on the rail that matched a rumor I remembered from childhood about saints who rot properly. The rumor had sounded like heresy then, and sounded like hospitality now. At my door I paused, and the door paused with me, because we had taught each other patience. Inside a draft carried the smell of damp wood and distant soup. The smell found my hunger, and my hunger stood and shook its fur and came to heel. I cooked nothing, and still I ate, because the air had learned how to feed me. I swallowed slowly, and each swallow felt like a small agreement between throat and world. I sat and wrote on a scrap of packing paper with a nub of pencil the lessons my skin kept teaching. Pain is a messenger, not a monarch. Rot is a conversation, not a verdict. Softness is not surrender, it is strategy. Sharing heat makes more heat. Sevens are patient, bells are kinder when you stop pretending they are alarms. I pinned the scrap above my bunk with a bent nail that had already forgiven me for bending it. The lacquer along my ribs warmed at the sight of words made true by repetition. Flies settled on the corner like punctuation. I lay down, and the mattress accepted both of us, me and the rot that loves me back, as tenants who pay on time. It creaked once in approval, and the sound was not the end of anything. It was the sound a gate makes when it swings the way it wants to swing. I breathed and felt the gardeners clock off for the night in shifts like men who trust their replacements. They left notes for the morning written in filaments my nerves could read. Mend here, moisten there, open when ready, close without shame. I drifted and did not fall because falling is for men who think ground is an enemy. Ground is a partner when it has been fed. I had been feeding it for days without knowing, and it had been feeding me for years without thanks. We had finally learned each other's names, and the names fit in the mouth like ripe fruit. The fruit did not bruise when spoken, because the speaking was gentle. Gentleness had learned my address, and stopped knocking before entering. It entered. The bells began as a tremor in the ducts that turned my breath into a drumhead. Each chime walked down the spine of the hive like a giant with soft feet. Workers looked up the way fields look up before rain. Krill barked about schedules, and the bark fell apart in the bell's mouth. I saw dust lift from handrails and arrange itself into rings as if a pebble had entered the air. Flies took their places along the lumen housings like a choir putting down lunch to pick up the next verse. 7 notes uncoiled and settled into my ribs with the familiarity of old coats. We filed into the spine because even skepticism has legs that obey. The procession came like weather that had remembered its favorite street. First, the scent, a cordial of cloves, damp wool, penny copper, and peelings saved for stock. Then the smoke, not thin incense but stew turned to breath. Then the footfalls, iron speaking kindly to iron. The death guard filled the corridor the way a river fills a thirsty ditch. Their plates were not clean, and therefore they were honest. Verdigris ran like tears that never needed to be hidden. Poxmarks read like medals awarded by time itself. On their pauldrons hung bells whose rust had learned to sing. The bells did not shout purity, they persuaded weight to become rhythm. I stood with my back to the rail, and the rail warmed to keep me from thinking about leaving. Mira pressed in at my side, and her elbow found the lacquered part of my arm and rested there without asking. Her eyes widened and then softened, as if remembering a lullaby badly, and then recalling the tune. A plague marine slowed, and the corridor slowed with him. His lens eyes regarded us the way ovens regard bread that has done its best. Steam curled from a thurible and folded over my shoulders like a shawl borrowed from a grandmother who forgives stains. The shawl smelled of orange pith, cellar apples, clean rot, and the iron edge that keeps sweetness from lying. His voice arrived before his words and put gravel into honey and honey into gravel. "Grandfather favors those who accept the burden of living," he said, and the sentence landed in my collarbones like a tool that finally found its hook. I felt the sevens along my chest hum with a disciplined pleasure. He did not lift his hand to touch me, and still my skin felt the weight of a gauntlet that knew exactly how heavy I was. Blessing does not always require contact, and I had enough contact inside me to understand. Behind him, a bearer cranked a hinge on a censer, and a new note joined the bells, low and forgiving. I breathed in and felt the lacquer along my ribs loosen a fraction, to let the note pass and stay. A Nurgling peeked from a cracked vent grate and waved a spoon as if to confirm that all of this was soup. The marine's lenses caught a lumen and flashed the green of healthy lichen. He spoke again, and his words came like tools sorted on a shadow board. "Pain is not your enemy when it keeps appointments. Fear is not your captain when it eats alone. Decay is not your death when it knows your name." Each assertion placed itself on the shelf of my mind without argument. Mira's breath shuddered once and steadied into a deeper cadence, and her shoulder stood taller by the width of a finger. I tasted copper and cloves and a fleeting salt that might have been somebody else's tears, and they did not embarrass the air. The Marine swung his censer, and the smoke traced a lazy figure 8 that looked like 2 zeros deciding not to count. He spoke of burdens as guests that arrive uninvited and leave full. He spoke of labor as prayer done with knuckles. He spoke of rot as hospitality extended to endings until they become beginnings by manners alone. I felt my old arguments sit down softly in the aisle, and listen with their hats in their hands. Krill tried to frown the bells into silence, and the bells patted his frown with gloved compassion until it became a rest. The choir of flies shifted key, and the key fit the lock behind my sternum with such accuracy I laughed before I knew why. The laugh startled a child 2 bodies down who had been taught to fear laughter when uniforms fill a hall. The child's mother gripped his wrist, and I exhaled a parcel of warmth, and it uncurled around her knuckles, and she forgot to be scolded by habit. On a banner draped from a lamppost, mildew had painted a map of rivers that did not exist in our district, and still everyone understood where they flowed. The Marine recited a litany that listed common harms with artisan detail. Splinter in the pad of the thumb. Steam bite caught and held. Quota weight on the back of the neck. Loneliness that salts every meal. He named them without pomp, and each name loosened its bootlaces and sat down to be tended. When he said hunger, a cart appeared behind him, pushed by a mortal pilgrim whose eyes had seen gardens and kept the rumor alive. The cart held bowls, and the bowls held a thick broth, the color of forgiveness. We did not lunge, and we did not pretend disinterest. We stepped forward in the pace set by the bells, and were served in the order that happened. The spoon in my bowl was a bent strip of stamped metal, and it had been cleaned by boiling, not by polish, and it thanked my fingers for believing in it. I ate and tasted marrow and peel and the slow patience of beans. The broth carried a slight bitterness that meant honesty had been invited and not turned away at the door. Mira's bowl trembled and then quieted. And when our spoons clicked, we looked at one another and nodded because words would have scuffed the moment. The Marine spoke of gifts that arrive disguised as leaks and failures. He said a crack is not a sin when it lets soup cool to a temperature that will not hurt a mouth. He said time is not a tyrant when it is taught to keep company. He said sevens are not magic, they are promises to count slowly. A pilgrim with a bell braided into her hair struck it gently with a thumbnail, and the note braided with the steam rising from the bowls. I felt the note find the bruise on my shin and smooth it the way bakers smooth dough after a fold. A man from Bay 4 raised his hand because some men only know how to speak when allowed, and the Marine let his hand be seen. The man said he had been faithful to purity, and still he suffered, and the Marine nodded, as if finally someone had put the kettle on. "Purity is a diet," he said, "and a diet without fat starves the tongue of joy. Take fat, take salt, take rot that has learned its trade. Feed your days until they stop biting you." The man cried, and the floor accepted the tears like rain that makes more of itself. A bee-thick drone floated overhead with the dignity of a ceiling fan that has known summers and winters and kept its bearings. It shed a fine dust that did not settle as grit, but as polish. The polish found my tools in my pockets and gave them a memory of easier turns. A Nurgling climbed my boot and drew a snot-slicked sigil on the leather that looked like a ladle, and then patted it approvingly. I did not scold it for the stain, because the stain smelled of pantry and kept the leather from cracking. The Marine told a parable about a bell that thought its job was warning and learned it was invitation. He said the bell had been lonely and did not know the word for hunger until it rang slow beside cauldrons. He said the bell learned to speak soup. We nodded because everyone there had known a tool that had been misused and had forgiven it in the end. The bells changed their gait, and the corridor's heartbeat followed. Even Krill's wrist chrono ticked in time for 3 long minutes, and did not dare to run ahead. I remembered the administratum voice that had once told me about sacred service, and I tasted the dryness of that room, and then the broth rinsed it away without insult. The Marine's helm turned and paused upon my collar where the constellations had been making geography. He said nothing aloud, and my sevens replied with a warmth that could have been a bow. He raised his censer and let a thread of smoke hang between us like a shared rope, pulled hand over hand by friends hauling something useful from a well. In the smoke I saw hands that were mine, and not mine, bruised and clean, old and new, washing potatoes that did not mind their eyes being removed because they trusted the soup. The Marine moved on, and the air moved on with him and left behind a climate. That climate was not temporary like weather, but portable like a shawl folded and taken with you. People around me breathed as if their chests had grown bigger by a finger's width and their belts had remembered an extra hole. Mira's laugh returned uninvited and sat at the edge of her mouth like a guest who knows it is welcome. A pilgrim brushed my hand with the back of her fingers in the old way that asks nothing and gives permission, and our lacquer said, "Amen," without superstition. The bells lifted into a brighter register, and the flies matched them with the tidy industry of shopkeepers opening shutters. I watched a child tilt his head to listen, not with ears, but with the soft behind the eyes where stories settle. His mother's prayer softened at the corners and turned into a recipe. She mouthed ingredients, and I read them and tasted them, and wished her a pot that never burned at the bottom. The procession took a corner, and the bells bent with the hallway and did not scrape. The smell lingered like a ribbon tied to a wrist to remind you of a task you now actually want to do. Behind us, the line restarted without its usual cough. Gauges eased into their numbers as if numbers were not orders, but agreements. Krill tried to count us faster, and the count came out as a litany of gratitude disguised as metrics. I swallowed the last sip of broth, and the spoon was clean without being washed, because mouths can do housework when they care. The bowl was taken by a pilgrim with a basket that had been mended many times, and the mends were its pride. I thanked her with a nod that included my sternum, and she tipped the bell in her hair at me with a sound only I seemed to hear. On the way back to the bays, workers touched hand to chest, not as salute, but as inventory. Each touch looked like someone checking for a key they now trusted themselves to carry. The hum in the ducts tuned itself to the gait of our steps, as if steps and hum had always been two halves of the same song. Mira said nothing, and I said nothing, and between us a third silence bloomed that fed on neither of us, and fed both. At my station, the wheels took a bite of stone that was measured and merciful. Sparks rose and chose not to sting. A jawed clamp that often snapped at my thumb opened like a mouth about to receive bread. The sevens on my collar tickled, and I touched them as one touches lucky coins, not for luck, but for the story that keeps being true. I remembered the Marine's voice and found it stored behind my sternum like a ladle on a nail near the stove. I could lift it when needed and put it back warm. When a pipe hissed sharp, I did not flinch against an enemy. I set a palm out, and the hiss tasted my lacquer and softened to a simmer that wanted to be useful. The bell note I had learned traveled down my arm like gravy finding every ditch. The ditch filled and did not flood. At the edges of my vision, flies patrolled with the slow authority of wardens who prefer rehabilitation to punishment. They wrote small circles in the steam that read, "As our hours, and our hours did not protest being read." The day unspooled in measures that matched bowls rather than clocks. We took breaks that fed the work instead of starving it clean. I heard the scrap of a prayer in the ventilators and realized the hive had been praying to its own stomach for a long time without language. Now it had a little language and a lot of appetite, and both are wholly in a place built to starve. On the tram home, bells kept time somewhere unreachable and still entirely here. I saw a hab door propped with a bucket and steam curling out, and neighbors who used to measure spoons by suspicion now measuring by need. A boy carried a pot with both hands and did not spill because bells make steadier feet. At my landing, the shrine's candle had run and pooled, and the pool had set and cracked and sprouted the tiniest fuzz that might one day decide to be something. I touched the fuzz with a fingertip, and the fingertip tingled with messages that needed no letters. I heard again the Marine say ordinary and felt the word spread under my skin like gravy under potatoes. Ordinary can be a sacrament when it is allowed to be warm. I unlocked my hab and the lock turned without argument because even stubborn metal respects a sermon delivered by bells and bowls. Inside, I set my tools on the table, and their edges reflected a dull, contented light like teeth after bread. On the wall, the scrap of packing paper with my notes breathed a little, as if paper too enjoys being read by someone who means it. I hung my coverall, and it sagged with the relief of work that will be there tomorrow and will be faced by hands that have learned to accept help. I stood at the sink and cupped water, and it thickened of its own accord, the way water does when it chooses to be kind. I drank, and on my tongue the broth of earlier returned like a chorus. Outside the corridor carried the distant jangle of a child inventing a bell from bolts and string. The invented bell tried several names and settled on a note that tugged a smile out of the corner of my mouth. The lacquer along my ribs responded like a choir that knows the refrain. Somewhere a fly approved with a single soft tap on the lumen that felt like a period placed after a sentence that will keep on meaning more. I sat and let the shawl of smoke I had carried home slide back over my shoulders, and its weight was just enough to remind me to keep listening. Not everyone blooms, and I felt the fork open inside me like a wishbone. On one side, a path of jerks and hunger, and a mouth taught only to gnash. On the other, a path of widening, and a mouth taught to bless. The choice did not arrive as trumpets or laws. It arrived as a spoon held out and a question that tasted of steam. Do you want to be fed, or do you want to remain starving in the shape of a man? I let the question sit in my ribs until it warmed the lacquer there. I said yes to being fed, and the lacquer softened as if it had been waiting by the stove. My breath slowed as though it had been running toward me for years, and now could stop. Flies made a ring around my hands, and the ring felt like a handle. I lifted myself by that handle without moving at all. Skin loosened in courteous seams that did not tear. Old tightness unbuttoned itself with patient clicks. Beneath the first layer, a second stood ready like work clothes laid out the night before. It was damp and sturdy, and smelled of cellars that keep storms at bay. I did not split like fruit dropped on steps. I peeled like fruit offered on a plate. The old rind folded itself, and did not accuse the new of stealing its place. I tucked it under the bed of my breath, the way you tuck a shawl for later. Heat pooled at my scapula and ran toward the spine in 2 warm ropes. They braided themselves without my help, and tightened and held. Shoulders rested lower by the width of 7 breaths. My ribs learned to open like doors with oiled hinges. Inside the opening, a draught moved that did not chill. It smelled of dill and cloves and the dust of long shelves. The draught carried small sounds, Nurglings chuffing and rearranging small comforts, gardeners clipping with tiny shears that did not hurt, spore bells dinging like teaspoons on thick cups. My blood thickened a little and lost its panic. It flowed as if every corridor it used to rush had become a hallway with benches. In those hallways, old aches sat and swung their legs. They did not beg to be noticed. They were simply not alone for the first time. A tincture spread through cartilage and taught it to sit in patience rather than in sand. Knees hummed a bass line, elbows sang harmony. The knot behind my heart opened like a fist seeing sunlight through steam. Memory crowded close and tried to make a scene, and was seated kindly in the front row. No memory was turned away at the door. Each was given a bowl and a place to put its spoon. The hive's hum shifted to meet my pulse instead of the other way around. I walked into the corridor, and the corridor introduced itself again. Metal admitted its fatigue and allowed soft to help carry hard. Paint bubbled in a corner, and the bubbles learned to be eyes for watching leaks arrive politely. The shrine's candle stump gave off a ghost of heat that knew my name. I touched the metal rail and felt its impatience cool 1 degree. I whispered an apology to a bolt I had once sworn at. The bolt forgave me with a creak that sounded like gratitude trying out a voice. Down in the spine, workers moved with the bell's new arithmetic. The arithmetic counted in ladles and rests and hands that checked on other hands. The death guard had passed, but their sermon had left measurement behind. My feet found the measure as if I had been practicing for years in my sleep. I reached my bay, and the wheels met the stone with a kiss instead of a bite. Sparks rose and chose to be fireflies, and then chose to be ash, and then chose to be nothing at all without complaint. The jaws of the clamp opened with a sigh and closed with a promise. I promised back by not forcing what did not want to hurry. Mira glanced over, and her eyes held less winter. She held up a finger with a paper cut like a thin moon. I blew on it, and the cut filled with glaze that was not mine, and was not hers, and was ours. She flexed and pressed, and did not feel the usual sting that proves you are alive by making you suffer for it. She smiled like a child who has been given a task with real tools. Krill walked by and failed to find purchase on an old rant. His mouth remembered the shape, but the words slid off the lacquered air. I felt sorry for his throat and wished him a slow stew that would teach him to count to 7 between orders. The wish rose like steam and found him despite his ledger. He blinked and scratched and coughed and did not shout for a span that the clock could not monetize. By mid-shift, my skin spoke new language to the tools. Where it met hot housing, it negotiated a temperature that wasted nothing. Where it met rough edge, it suggested a compromise with a film that behaved like a polite glove. My hands did not bleed for the machine anymore. They bartered. They traded warmth for compliance and patience for precision. Grease that used to bite now listened. It aligned itself along the line of my intent, the way a creek aligns to a fallen branch. Intent grew heavier and more visible to things that are usually blind. A man from Bay 4 walked toward me with his whole day in his shoulders. He carried the slouch of 10,000 cuts. He pretended he was only asking for a wrench. He held out a bruised forearm by accident. The bruise had the color of old plums and the sheen of wet leather. I touched it with the back of my knuckles, and a warmth moved into it like stock moving into scraps. The purple loosened and split into yellow and green, and then into a story about a door that had finally been oiled. He exhaled, and something that had been living high in his chest climbed down 2 steps. He did not thank me, because he did not owe me anything. He stood straighter by 1 honest degree, and that was enough payment to last all morning. In the vents, the flies carried messages like slow couriers who know every corner. They tapped 7s with their feet on the lumen housings. The taps coordinated with the bell note that now lived under my breastbone like a stove. The stove did not blaze, it banked. It kept a coal ready for rain. When I coughed, it was not to expel, but to encourage. It was bellows work rather than alarm. A silvery filament drifted out of me and curled on my palm and sank back in with a nod. I nodded back because we were colleagues now. Not master and wound, not patient and plague. Colleagues in the trade of mending. The garden in my chest widened like a lens. Paths formed with moss to keep bare feet from splinters. Mushrooms pushed their domes where worry used to not. Each dome held the weight of a thought and redistributed it into humor. A vine found the scar along my left forearm and traced it like a map to clean water. The scar softened and became an old road on a new map. At break, a pilgrim passed with a bucket and bowls and a lid that clucked comfortably. She dipped me a ladle without asking for script or badge. Her hand smelled of rind and steam and coins that have passed through markets. I drank, and the broth met hunger like a friend meets a friend at a gate. They walked side by side into the rest of the shift. No one saluted. No one rang a bell to dismiss the taste. It stayed in the mouth as a thick vowel that sweetened blunt words. After shift, the tram swayed with human weight that had learned new balance. Arguments that used to start at stops now started as recipes. People compared the patience of beans and the honesty of cabbage. The talk filled the car with steam that did not fog the windows so much as polish them. I watched my reflection and saw the gloss of someone kept. Not kept like property. Kept like bread in a good box. Kept like tools oiled and hung on a board with shadows behind them. My eyes had the glaze of pastry that intends to be eaten by family, not displayed behind glass. I touched my collar, and the constellation there had learned a new route. Some stars went dim like embers that had finished their part. New ones lifted like lids on jars being opened for supper. The paths they drew were not straight. They curved toward kitchens and away from altars that demanded stone for stone's sake. A child stared and smiled with all his teeth, and I stuck out my tongue stained with broth. He laughed because holiness that can be teased is rarer than the other kind. At my landing, the shrine flickered, and the wax had sagged into little bellies. Someone had left a heel of bread there on a scrap of cloth. The heel had been tasted and put back. This felt like the correct order for offerings. Taste and return and taste again. Inside my hab, the air had learned my slow bell. It kept time with the soft knock of pipes. I hung my coverall, and it sighed like an animal lying down on straw that smells of old sun. The Nurgling who had declared my pocket a chapel peered out from the laundry bin. It brandished a safety pin like a scepter, and then used it to fasten a tear in my cuff with ceremonial seriousness. I bowed because small repairs deserve ceremony. It burbled and left a snail trail of blessing along the seam. The seam accepted the snail's theology and held. I sat at the table and placed my hands flat to listen with the palms. The lacquer pulsed like a distant drum heard through warm earth. It counted to 7 and then rested and then counted again. Between counts, I felt filaments climb the rafters of my thoughts and string lanterns. Each lantern lit a memory not to interrogate it, but to keep it safe during weather. I watched the lanterns sway and learned the wind's phrasing. No gust blew hard enough to snap a line. I stood, and the lines swayed with me, and I did not fear tangles, because tangles feed hands the work they want. A fever knocked again because old visitors test new households. I opened the door and the fever came in with its coat unbuttoned, as if finally ready to behave. It sat by the stove and put its feet up and grumbled about purity. I ladled it broth and it drank and felt ridiculous. It sweated politely and excused itself and left a damp ring that smelled of pennywort. I wiped the ring with a cloth that had already memorized my touch. The cloth left behind a shine that would help the next guest see where to sit. In the mirror, my teeth looked like tools, not threats. They were blunt where bread demands bluntness. They were sharp where apples require truth. My tongue wore a film like thin jam, and the jam tasted faintly of clove and old citrus. I spoke to myself, and the words did not scratch, coming out. They slid with enough friction to be held and enough ease to be used. Through the vent I heard bells practicing a slower hymn. The hymn counted the ways a city can be sick and still be worth doctoring. I added under my breath the ways a man can be broken and still be a bowl. I was a bowl now. I was lined with something that made cracks into lanes rather than into losses. People poured their small sorrows into me without shame, and I warmed them with a heat that did not burn my hands. When I tipped, I did not spill. I decanted. I let what I could no longer carry flow into soil that had been waiting. The soil answered by sending up a sprig at the base of my neck that no one could see. I felt it bend toward a light made of bells and breath. The sprig leafed, and the leaves were cool on hot thoughts. They patted those thoughts like bandages, patted into place by steady fingers. Down in the bay, a warning siren wailed because sirens do what they are paid to do. Workers panicked because they have been taught that panic is obedience. I walked to the valve and put my hand on the wheel, and the hum in my ribs told the wheel about soup. It told the wheel about low heat and long hours, and the way beans forgive you if you check them often. The wheel listened like a student saved by analogy. It turned with the weight of a stubborn uncle who finally agrees to dance. Steam sighed and sat back down. The siren realized it was alone and remembered a quieter job, and went to find it. People looked at me with suspicion, because relief mistrusts anything that does not send an invoice. I nodded and offered my palms, and the lacquer showed them it was not a trick only for me. A line formed that pretended to be idle talk. Hands brushed hands and small repairs consented to occur. In those brushes, I felt the garden extend through the hive like mycelium. It did not conquer. It connected. It found cracks and fed them softness until they became seams. It found seams and fed them patience until they became joints. Joints learned to bear more weight without forgetting to creak when they needed oil. Nights lengthened and did not threaten. In them I went to the garden without leaving the bunk. The gate was no longer heavy. It swelled when it rained and shrank when it dried, and both conditions were welcome. Mushrooms lit themselves and threw soft weather onto paths that remembered my feet. A massive fly with saintly composure let me scratch the velvet between its wings. It hummed a chord that ran down my spine and tuned bones I had not known were out. Trees exhaled spores like fog that wrote recipes on the air. Nurglings wrestled with the seriousness of priests on a festival day. A cauldron the size of a tram car burped joyfully and flipped a ladle with a gout of sweet steam. Grandfather laughed like a hillside, sliding into farmland instead of into ruin. The laugh pressed on me from every side and did not crush. It compacted. It turned all my straw into a bale that would feed somebody's hour. I pressed back with the pressure of a grateful chest and felt the exchange settle into an equilibrium that would not crack at the first knock. I asked for instructions and was given a spoon. I asked for absolution and was given a towel. I asked for meaning and was given more mouths to feed than I had hands. Hands appeared when the mouths appeared, because that is how meaning behaves when it is healthy. I woke with the weight of an invisible apron and the smell of dill in my hair. On my way to the works, a woman sagged at the rail and held her belly like a clock that has stopped. She did not want to be seen wanting anything. I stood near and let the bell in my ribs toll slow until her breathing negotiated a truce. She leaned, and the rail and I shared the weight evenly without speaking about it. When she straightened, she nodded as if we had signed papers. We had signed something better than papers. We had signed the agreement to continue. My steps carried that signature through doors that once stuck. The doors remembered their training and moved in their frames like shoulders that have finally learned to unclench. The sevens along my collar woke and dozed like content cats. They purred when someone else's pain came close and then rolled to make room. They groomed fear with small rasps until fear lay clean and could sleep. In the canteen, I ate slow and saved a piece of bread in my pocket for a future hunger I intended to meet kindly. The bread warmed against my hip like a promise written on actual paper Paper remembers better than voice when the room is loud. I tore the bread when a boy with hollow cheeks stared too openly. He took without flinching because hunger is polite when food is honest. He chewed and his eyes watered, and he did not apologize for the tears, and I did not require him to be brave. We shared a nod that tasted of rosemary and iron and the slow mathematics of repair. Back at the bay, the gauges performed a small grace by aligning without argument. A leak showed its shine early, as if eager to be part of the lesson. I caught it in a rag, and the rag darkened into a map with rivers that matched the mildew maps on the Pilgrim's banner. I folded the rag as if folding a letter to someone I trusted to read things properly. I placed it where the next hands would find it, and know they had been expected. The hum picked up the bell and set it down like a child who insists on carrying something heavy and learns they can. I let it and stood by in case it stumbled, and it did not stumble. My wrists had the strength of dough after the third fold. My back had the patience of shelves. My head had the quiet of libraries where no one polices the joy of research. I kept moving and not moving, and I kept breathing and not hurrying, and I kept listening and not concluding. And I kept the door to the garden on its hinges so that anyone who needed a path could find moss underfoot and a bell in the fog and a spoon that fit their hand and a place at the edge of the cauldron where steam makes a halo without asking for saints.